All right, we're going to look at the Reagan economic record today. The Reagan presidency is also referred to as the Reagan Revolution. I mean, this is the first real economic conservative to come into office to apply conservative economic principles, from cutting taxes to deregulation to trying to reduce the power of the federal government. These are all part of Reagan's principles and what he argues for throughout most of his life in politics. Takes office, entitlement programs are out of control. These are programs that provide guaranteed benefits to a particular group. So things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, these are entitlements. These are a problem today. We're in a situation where the entitlements are taking a bigger and bigger piece of the national budget. And nobody seems to be in too much of a hurry to apply fixes to these. And as 1980 approaches, these things were growing in number. We were spending about $300 billion a year on entitlement programs, on entitlement spending. And people begin to resent a lot of these programs. They see that their tax dollars are being taken out of their paycheck, but they're not seeing much of a benefit from it. The election of '80 comes along. You have Carter running as the incumbent Democratic candidate. Reagan wins the Republican nomination, and Reagan runs on a ticket of a belief in government that our founders. The essence of Reagan's platform is government is not the solution to our problems, but government is the problem. This is something Reagan would repeat over and over again. That the government had gone too far. If you think back. At the turn of the century in 1900, 80 years prior to Reagan taking office, you have Theodore Roosevelt looking at it and saying government's not involved enough. There's virtually no government oversight of business, and they are taking advantage, and it's becoming very bad. But by the time 1980 rolled around, for Reagan and for many others, the opposite ran true, that government now had gone too far and gotten themselves too involved with economics and regulations, and the government was the reason that the economy was stifling. It wasn't the people. It wasn't that government wasn't doing enough. It was that government was doing too much. Reagan favors free enterprise. He opposes big government. He wants to reduce the power of the federal government. The free market is something Reagan believed in very strongly. He often mentioned the benefits of the free market and looked at sectors of our economy where you may have had some government involvement, you may have had some government regulation and government oversight that had gone too far, and there may have been other examples where government had left things alone and let things be free, and Reagan would point these out as being more prosperous and better. So with 1980, you have Carter with a weak foreign policy. The economy is struggling. You have double-digit unemployment. You have double-digit inflation. You also have foreign policy issues with the Iran hostage situation. And all of these things lead to Reagan's success in the election of 1980. Reagan eventually becomes the oldest president in U.S. history. He is elected at 70 years old. He takes office at 69 and turns 70 very shortly after he becomes. Now, Reagan's whole economic philosophy was what's called supply-side economics. This becomes known as Reaganomics, and it also is referred to as trickle-down economics. Anyone that refers to it as trickle-down, they are trying to belittle the supply-side theory. So the way supply-side economics works, this is the whole theory behind it, that you need to reduce taxes. That as taxes get too high, people aren't able to save as much. The government's taking too much money, and if the government takes too much money, people don't have the ability to save more. But if you reduce this, people pay less, they'll save more. That happens, banks have more money to lend to businesses. If businesses have more money, they can increase their supply of goods. If you increase the supply of something, you can bring down the price of it as well. So this is the whole idea, and Reagan's philosophy is essentially that people can do better things with their money than the government can. Businesses can grow the economy if they're able to keep more of their hard-earned dollars, and individuals can grow the economy if they're able to keep more of their hard-earned dollars. So that's the whole point. And like I said, in class, Reagan's all about giving the individual more freedom with their money, more freedom from regulation, giving businesses more freedom. And Reagan's able to do this. He brings down tax rates significantly. He simplifies the tax code. By the time Reagan leaves office, we have two tax brackets essentially for income tax, and we see unprecedented economic growth during Reagan's 8 years in office. The top rate when Reagan took office on what's called unearned income was 73%. Reagan brings that down to 28%. And in the process of bringing that down to 28%, he doubles revenue from those income earners at that top rate. Reagan's belief that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector. In other words, there are things that government has to legitimately do. The government has to have an army. The government, has the post office. There's a lot of legitimate functions of government. But when you go outside those legitimate functions, when government starts meddling into things that they don't or aren't supposed to go into, they don't do it as well as economically. Conservatives would always argue the Obamacare rollout is a perfect example of this. The government had to create a website for people to be able to access Obamacare, to be able to purchase Obamacare. And what wound up happening was the government created such a failed website. It crashed. It was terrible. Now, if this were to happen in the private sector, that business would go away. People would stop using it. People would stop doing it. When government gets involved in things, they have a monopoly on them. And they don't have competition. They don't have those issues. So they, if a business rolled out a website as bad as Obamacare, that business would fail. It would go away, and somebody that knew better and knew what they were doing, it would work. But that wasn't the case. People had to deal with it. They were stuck with this website, crashing for months, made it extremely difficult for people to find out what their options were and purchase health insurance through the Obamacare exchange. When you think about a lot of the luxuries you have in your life, they come from the private sector. They don't come from government. The other issue is regulation. There was so much regulation on businesses during this time period. An example of this is in the airline industry. And in the airline industry, if you were an airline, you were required to fly certain places a certain amount of time. So you had to fly to certain cities. Even if you couldn't profit off it, you had to fly to certain cities. So what happens? Well, let's say flights from Newark to Dallas, Texas, they aren't very popular, but the airline, they have to fly X amount of flights there per week or month or year or whatever it is. Well, they can't make money on these. They're flying planes that don't have as many people on them as they should. They're not flying full planes, and they're losing money. But airlines aren't going to lose money, or they're going to go out of business. So what do airlines do? Well, all right, let's raise the price on the more popular flights. So Newark to Orlando, Florida, those flights are really good. So are popular. So they jack up the price on the flight to Florida to make up for what they're losing elsewhere. So one of the deregulatory measures that Reagan makes is they get rid of that. Fly where it's profitable. Don't worry about if flying at cities X amount of times per year. If you don't make money off it, or you can only make a certain amount by flying a certain amount of time, then do that. And what's the result? Prices go down. Airlines have more freedom to profit on the airline routes that are best for them versus what government is telling them is best for them. Another crazy regulation was the backhaul regulation. So if you drove a tractor trailer full of goods across state lines, so if you went from New Jersey to Pennsylvania with a tractor trailer, you could not return that truck to New Jersey with a full load of goods without filling out mountains of paperwork that made it completely unworth going through the process. They got rid of that crazy one. That's another example. And all this does, it increases competition and resulted in lower prices for the consumer. So these were, ways to tackle inflation, ways to go after it that Carter presidency didn't do, that no one had really done. And here's Reagan, reducing these, burdensome regulations that were stifling business, that were hurting business, and in turn hurting the consumer. Because in the end, anytime costs go up and government makes costs go up on certain things, those companies will pass that down to the consumer. The one thing about the Reagan economy, deficits rise under Reagan pretty dramatically. They go up in numbers we hadn't seen before. Now, government revenue goes up by a lot, but the federal spending still outpaced that revenue. So this is the big knock on the Reagan economy, is that the deficits increased dramatically during his time in office. There's a couple of things we'll talk about in class about that when it comes. There's a few reasons for that, but in Reagan's farewell speech, to his credit, Reagan asked the question to himself, "Is there anything I regret?" And he said, "Yes, I regret the deficit. I did not want to leave office with a deficit higher than I came into it. But unfortunately, that happened."